It was a typical afternoon on our family farm. The air was crisp and the sun hung low, casting a soft golden hue over the land. I was inside the house, just finishing up a book while my parents were out for dinner. I had the whole place to myself, and it felt comforting in its silence. Our farm is out in the middle of nowhere, with no neighbors for miles, and I liked it that way. It was peaceful. That's when I heard the knock. At first it was quiet, a soft tap at the door. I almost ignored it, but then it came again, louder, persistent. I stood up and walked to the door, curious. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially not out here. When I looked through the peephole, I saw a man standing on the porch. He looked worn. His clothes were dirty, his face rugged and scruffy, like he'd been on the road for a long time. I opened the door cautiously, just a crack. "Hey there," he said, his voice rough, as if he hadn't spoken much lately. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm lost. I was hoping you could point me in the direction of the next town, Millfield. I've been walking 4 hours, and I'm not sure which way to go." There was something in his eyes, something desperate, almost pleading. He was standing too close, his hand resting on the doorframe, like he was about to lean in. But I didn't feel threatened. Not at first. "Millfield is about 20 miles away," I told him. "You won't make it tonight, not unless you've got a car. It's getting dark." He nodded slowly, and for a second I thought he was going to turn around and leave. But then his face hardened, and he spoke again, this time with a slight tremble in his voice. "Would it be all right if I stayed for a bit? Just until night falls. I'll be gone once it's dark." Something inside me told me to say no. Something about the way he was standing there, his eyes too wide, his body tense like he was trying to stay calm but failing, gave me an uneasy feeling. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice steady despite the rising anxiety in my chest. "My parents aren't home, and I don't let strangers in when they're not here." The man's expression faltered just for a moment. Then he stepped back from the door and nodded, his face returning to that blank, unreadable mask. "I understand," he muttered before turning and walking away, his boots crunching on the gravel as he disappeared around the corner of the house. I closed the door and locked it, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. He seemed harmless, but something about him wasn't right. I tried to push it from my mind, but I couldn't. I sat back down on the couch, the flickering glow of the TV casting shadows around the room. The minutes stretched into hours and the night grew deeper. I was alone, surrounded by silence, and it felt heavy. That's when I heard it, a soft sound outside the window. Tap. I froze. The room was still, too still, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Tap. It came again, louder this time. I cautiously stood and walked toward the window, my heart pounding in my chest. My house isn't big. There's only one window in the living room that faces the front yard, and I knew exactly what I would see before I even looked. The man. He was standing just outside, his back slightly hunched, a cigarette dangling from his lips. The ember glowed bright against the darkness, casting strange shadows on his face. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring into the distance, his eyes glazed over, but it felt like he was staring straight through me. I stood frozen, my breath shallow. My pulse was so loud I could hear it in my ears. I didn't move. I couldn't. He took a long drag from the cigarette, then slowly turned his head and looked directly at me through the window. His eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The air around me seemed to tighten, pressing down on my chest. I wanted to scream, to run, but I stayed glued to the spot, unable to break free from his gaze. His mouth curled into a smile. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was something darker, something unsettling, like he knew exactly how terrified I was. My hand shook as I reached for my phone, dialing my parents' number as fast as I could. My fingers slipped once, twice, before I finally pressed the call button. Mom? Dad? My voice shook as I spoke. There's a man outside, the one who asked for directions earlier. He's standing by the window. I don't know what he wants. Please come home. I could barely hear my mother's voice over the phone, just static and broken words, but I could make out one thing clearly. We're on our way. Stay inside. Don't open the door. I hung up quickly, but I didn't feel any better. I was still trapped, staring at the man outside, who hadn't moved a muscle. His cigarette burned down to the filter, the orange glow lighting up his face, but he didn't seem to notice.